Okay. All right, we are true to our word. We are going to start. I'm not kissing anybody. Well, again, good evening. Earlier, I started by introducing some special guests. We're going to continue that now. Over the course of the years that this church has been in ministry, we have had phenomenal staff. Of equal importance is the staff that doesn't have reverend or doctor or anything like that in their title. They're the ones that really do a whole lot of work around here, the bulk of the work, perhaps even. And so I'm just going to ask Diane and Tracy, you're here. They're both going to kill me for telling them to stand up. Wave to everybody. And then we also have Karen Smith is back. And Don Weltlick. I hope I have by no means ever let you wonder how much you've been appreciated around here. And I hope I never have to try to catch up and make that message known. What, folks, let me do my thing. Is my mother here? And yes, she is. Anyway, thank you for your work for the Lord. Then earlier, I mentioned Michael and Ben, and I'm going to have them stand up again. And where'd Michael go? Oh, he's over there. Then we got Brett and Heather. And then we have, what's his name? Brian. Now here's the thing. You see, I get to stand up here and do a lot of the talking. To make this happen tonight, I did exactly this. I'm not joking. I've come up with what I've had to say, but Michael, Ben, Jenny, I wasn't going to forget you, no way. Brian, they planned this whole thing. This isn't my kind of gig, and they knew it, and they just, and it speaks again to the fact that I am an incredibly fortunate head of staff. So thank you all for making this happen, for being in my life. Michael.
So we are surrounded by history, and there are so many folks in this room, but we recognize that there are so many folks who couldn't be here tonight. Perhaps they've got other engagements elsewhere, or perhaps they have passed into the church triumphant. And so we remember tonight that we are surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses. We are one church here out of many in our presbytery. And so we are very grateful to welcome this evening our General Presbyter, Matt Skolnick, who's going to share a few words tonight about how we fit in and how we are an expression of God's church here. So let us welcome Reverend Matt Skolnick. Wow!
I've had all sorts of introductions, but never one like that before. Well, hello, Christ Presbyterian Church, and congratulations on 200 years. That's a big deal. I know Dave mentioned, 10% of Christian history right here, which is really phenomenal to think through. When I was thinking about it, my mind went to technology. And if you have a moment, go to your phone or computer and just Google inventions in the past 200 years. And if you do that and look through the list, you'd really get a good picture of what it was like. I don't think any of us would have wanted to live 200 years ago. Anyone love air conditioning? Right? The air conditioning, the earliest thing on the list that showed up in the patent, I think it was 1836, was the steam locomotive. So before the steam locomotive was Christ Presbyterian Church. And you can go all the way through modes of transportation, get you to the moon, right? You can also think about modes of communication. Radio was invented during this time, television, telegraph, all sorts of stuff. And so it was completely a different world. Tonight, I want to offer to you an image of the church to help frame what I pray would be the next 200 years for you. Our Methodist brothers and sisters have an image of the church, and it is that of a boat on the sea. And the idea is that the world is perilous out there, and if you come into the boat, we can kind of ride together and we will survive. That's not the image I want to use. I'm going to borrow from our Catholic brothers and sisters. One of the images that they use is a combination of, you ready for this one? A peacock and the tree of life. And I want to just focus on the tree of life. For me, the tree of life in the scripture is a very powerful and very meaningful image. Of course, it shows up in the book of Genesis. It also shows up at the end in the book of Revelation. And in the middle, in the Proverbs, it speaks about wisdom being like a tree of life. And so when I look at you, and I know of the ministries that you participate in, I see you as being like a tree of life. In a few moments, Jenny George will be here, and I think she'll share the history of Christ Presbyterian Church. I don't know how detailed that's going to be. I don't know all of the points. All the points, okay. She's going to do it month by month for the past 200 years. In May 1830, no. With that being said, all of it is beautiful, and I know that I'm not aware of all of it, so I look forward to gleaning from that. But there are a handful of things that I see in your congregation that I know that are active and well today that speak of you being a tree of life. One of them is your Tikva ministry. I have the pleasure of walking in and out of this building every once in a while, and I can't tell you how much it warms my heart to see those kids from the city just running around here. It's a ministry of joy, a ministry of safety, a ministry of healing. One other thing that I see in your congregation that I believe to be a wonderful representative of the tree of life are your Stephen ministers. There's a word that I consider a 4-letter word in the church. It's pastoral care. And the reason that I say it's a 4-letter word is because Christian care, spiritual care, is not something that pastors do. It's something that the whole church does. And so when I see a church like yours getting involved in spiritual care of one another, I celebrate it, I love it, I just bask in the light of it. I also know that your congregation has had a long-standing tradition with some native people out. Is it South Dakota? South Dakota. Ministries like that, when I stand back from afar and listen and hear the stories and watch what you do, it warms my heart. The one message I hope that you hear in all of this celebration, if you consider the church to be like a tree of life, I pray that you see all of those things and all of the things that Jenny will mention as the roots to the tree. And the question comes, in the next 200 years, what are the branches going to be? Those branches that get life and healing and wholeness, not just for the church and for the congregation, but for the community as a whole. And so tonight, as an offering to you, I commend the first chapter of Mark to you. I know you're not all going to pull out your Bibles from your purses or your back pockets or your cell phones, and I'm not going to give you a long sermon about any of it, but I would encourage you to pick up the Gospel of Mark chapter 1 and go to the portion right after the baptism, right after Jesus' temptation, and look at all of the types of ministries that Jesus is involved in that first chapter. And I pray that as I name those ministries and you identify those ministries, that as you think about being like a tree of life for the next 200 years, that you as an individual would be able to name what type of ministry did Jesus participate in there that God calls you to participate in. And then my prayer is that you would go to your pastors and your staff and say, I want to do that. And when you say that, they'll be like Jenny and just shake their head and smile and say, I would love to help you do that. So first of all, thank you for your 200 years of ministry. But second of all, thank you for your next 200 years that will reflect the tree of life. Amen.
At this time, I'm going to have the chancel choir come forward and form a very curious arrangement amongst the things here. As I do that, as they're coming forward, I think that as we celebrate 200 years of this church, it is certainly true that the people who have been a part of this adult choir at Christ Presbyterian Church have represented one of the spiritual backbones of the ministry. And so it's appropriate that we celebrate by singing something tonight to give you some idea of the level of commitment of the people who have been a part of this group, of our active roster, the roster that currently sings for Sunday services throughout the year. We just finished an inventory where they gave us a bunch of information about themselves and their experiences in the group. And the group that is represented by these people here, but also the rest of our singers, represents over 780 years of service. And we're probably missing some. But I find that number to be awe-inspiring and astounding. And It is going to be our great mission to ensure that that ministry continues and perpetuates and continues to be a spiritual backbone of this church. Thank you all.
Thank you, choir. That was fantastic. So, all right, before I get on with the formal part of my time up here, while I have you all very captive and sitting in your seats, I thought we could take a photo. I'm gonna try. I might have to do it over a couple of things, but I feel like I have a good view up here. So, thank you. All right. Oh, thanks for all being here tonight. I am just overjoyed. All right. So I could probably spend an entire day recounting Christ Presbyterian Church's 200 years of history. I could talk about our many programs, ministries, missions we've done over the last 200 years. I could talk about each of the incredible pastors we've had over these years and their contributions. We could spend the entire weekend talking about our amazing congregation. Well, I'm going to leave that part to Pastor Michael in our next segment. And tonight, I'm going to take us on a history tour of the building itself with some interesting tidbits thrown in. So the founding of Christ Church is woven tightly to the founding of Canton itself. Maybe.
Make it work, Brian.
Uh-huh. When Canton was laid out by its founder, Bezaleel Wells, in 1805, he designated 4 parcels of land for public purposes. 1 for a cemetery, 1 for a school, 1 for a courthouse, and 1 for a house of worship. The cemetery is now McKinley Park. The school, where Timken High School sits, across the street, and the courthouse is where our courthouse is still located. And 1 for a house of worship, which is right where you are sitting tonight. This plot, located on Tuscarawas Street, then spelled with a K, sat between Wells Street and Plum Street, which was later renamed McKinley Avenue in honor of President McKinley. For about 12 years, this plot was shared by two groups, a Reformed congregation and a Lutheran congregation. Together, they had combined their resources to build a small log structure for both groups to worship in on this land. Later, those groups found new locations in town to build their own structures. Our story begins around 1820. Prior to then, Presbyterians in the area worshiped in private homes or eventually the newly erected town hall and were cared for by traveling Presbyterian missionaries who would visit sporadically. But in 1820, a Presbyterian pastor by the name of Reverend McLean took charge of the congregation in Canton and, finding no previous record of a church organization, established the First Presbyterian Church of Canton, whose first meeting as a congregation was held on the 13th of September, 1821, 200 years ago. The total membership was 27. Reverend McLean only stayed about 18 months, leaving because of non-payment of his salary. The trustees ended up paying him out of their own pockets. In 1827, we took possession of this lot, but it took until 1833, after years of financial hardship and several starts and stops on the building itself, that the building was finally finished and dedicated. There were a few pastors in those early years, but in 1847, Reverend Ebenezer Buckingham was installed as the new pastor here, where he remained for 26 years. How about those mutton chops, right? It was during his time that the church started to see some real growth. And in 1866, plans to begin building a newer, larger stone church were underway. An architect out of Chicago, a Mr. Whitlock, designed the building. In the spring of 1867, the old church was torn down and the cornerstone of the new church was laid. Built for the cost of $56,000, that building still stands today as our first section of the larger building, where our sanctuary is located. There's a picture of the interior, and we have a picture of the exterior. We still have the original pulpit that we actually used in worship during our most current renovation, and several pews from that time are still in use in our chapel. While it took until 1871 for the new stone church to be dedicated, a very special event took place here before it was entirely finished. 3 months earlier, on January 25th, 1871, Major William McKinley, who would one day become our 25th president, married Ida Saxton in our sanctuary. So while we are celebrating 200 years as a church, the McKinleys also celebrated their 150th wedding anniversary, an event we were thrilled to be able to celebrate with a reenactment last summer in partnership with the National First Ladies Library. I think old Ebenezer would be pretty impressed with Michael's mutton chops. Since it's always of such great community interest, I thought I would share a few things about their wedding. There's a sweet story of their courtship where each Sunday, William and Ida's paths would cross on the road as they made their way to their prospective churches. William to First Methodist just down the road, and Ida to here, where her family worshiped. It is said that William proposed on one of these Sunday meetings by saying, "I think it would be much nicer if we could someday both go the same way." To which Ida replied, "I think so too." The wedding was quite the affair and the most anticipated event in town, with over 700 people attending. These days, we have seating for a little under 500 in that space. I can only imagine how crowded it must have been that day. The wedding was reported in newspapers from Canton to Boston to New York. Now today, this wedding is historically significant to so many people because of President McKinley. But the reason it was such a big deal at the time was because of Ida and her family. The Saxtons were one of the most prominent families in Canton. Ida's grandfather, John, having founded the Canton Repository, and her father, James, was a successful businessman and founded the Stark County Bank. It's been said that this church might not have been built if not for the support and influence of the Saxton family. James was on the church building committee, and Ida was actively involved in helping to raise funds for the church's construction. I have one fun story to share about the wedding that has to do with Reverend Ebenezer Buckingham of Mutton Chop fame, who was to officiate the ceremony. It turns out he was a bit forgetful, and at 7:30, the start time came and went, and there was no sign of him. They sent men out to look for him, and someone even went and grabbed the Reverend from Trinity Lutheran across the street, just in case. Thankfully, in the nick of time, the good Reverend arrived, to everyone's relief. After the building itself was done, the stone bell tower was constructed at the northeast corner of the building in 1887. Here's an image of the church with that bell tower. The 4,000-pound bell that was installed then is still in our bell tower, though the tower itself was relocated to its present location in the southeast corner in a later project as it wasn't holding up structurally. I suspect that had something to do with the 4,000-pound bell. In those days, the bell operated manually with a bell ringer pulling the rope from a ladder while in full view of the congregation. There's a story that on one occasion the bell ringer took his place on the ladder, began pulling the rope, and losing his footing, fell off the ladder. It was written that the women were overcome by the sight. True words. Sadly, we have no records on the fate of this young man. These days, the bell we use is operated electronically. Though I will say, the ladder up to the bell tower has certainly seen better days, which I figured out when I took that picture. In 1911, 40 years after the church was built, construction began on our first major expansion, a large addition to the south end of the building that added Sunday school space, the new bell tower, a new organ, as well as reversing the chancel in the sanctuary from the south end, like how it is now, to the north end. With this additional investment in the building, the church sought to have legal title to the lot. And in 1916, the heirs of Bezaleel Wells deeded the land to the church for the sum of $1,181.85. The work was completed in December of 1912 for a cost of around $60,000 and added 20 small classrooms around a main room. Now, I wish I had a picture of this, but apparently when that addition was constructed, the wall that separated the new Sunday school area from the sanctuary could be opened. Now, church lore is that this wall opened not with doors, but by being raised up using a crank. Right? If anybody has a picture of that, please come see me. Here's an exterior picture following that renovation. Here's another picture from back then as well. If you notice, our old stained glass windows used to open. I'm sure it was very helpful in the time back before air conditioning. The chairperson of the finance committee for that renovation was a Charles Vickery of the CN Vickery Company. Some of you may remember he used to be a fine men's clothier downtown. It was a fine store downtown and one of the first stores in the newly constructed Belden Village Mall. I thought I'd share an interesting, though sad, story about a gift they made to the church that is still in use today. The baptismal font was used in our sanctuary from 1921 until last year. It now lives in the chapel across the hall, as due to its age, it's becoming a bit fragile. The Vickeries donated the font in memory of their daughter, Grace Vickery Podorf. You see, Grace had recently married John Podorf, longtime principal of McKinley High School, and they had a little daughter, Louise. In October of 1920, when Louise was only 3 weeks old, Grace took a terrible fall getting out of the bathtub and hitting the base of her head on the faucet, died instantly at 35 years old. I can imagine that the family struggled with how to cope with this unexpected accidental death. But that's not the end of the story. The very first person to be baptized in that font was Grace's little daughter, Louise. By the time the church celebrated its 100th anniversary in 1921, membership had grown to over 1,000 members, and programs and classes and mission work flourished. Of course, after the stock market crash of 1929 and the Depression following, the church saw a substantial decrease in both funds and membership. When the bank closed on October 21st, 1931, the small amount of funds the church had remaining were frozen, and they were left with only petty cash to run the church's finances. Thankfully, the trustees were able to keep the church afloat by running on tight budgets, and by 1936, we were back to a relatively safe position. Of course, that meant starting to talk about another renovation. In March of 1941, Harry Everhard, who was instrumental in this next renovation, gathered a group together at the church to talk about doing some remodeling. The organ was in bad shape, again, and people were talking about wanting to flip the sanctuary back around. There was also talk about maybe adding a small chapel. But it took a few years before those early plans grew to become what actually ended up being built. You see, in 1942, a young man, just 30 years old, became the church's 16th pastor. His name was George Parkinson. He was an engaging, dynamic man, and he jumped right on board the idea of expanding the building to match his now growing congregation. And as the congregation grew, so did the ideas. They held 2 fundraising campaigns, the first in 1945 and the second in 1946, to fund these initial ideas. But then the building committee started to really consider their current and future needs against this initial modest plan. Working with a Mr. A. Hensel Fink, a nationally known church architect, they decided that to meet their needs, they would add an entire new wing on the west side of the building called Westminster Hall. It would hold the new fellowship hall and kitchen, larger chapel, and classrooms in the lower level and on the second floor. They decided that they would complete this work first so that they could use this space for worship while they raised money in a third campaign to renovate the sanctuary in the second phase of construction. By 1949, plans were finalized and they were ready to proceed. The Warren Hoffman Company was contracted as the builder, and the groundbreaking ceremony took place on November 13, 1949. Now, that dapper fellow standing to the right of Reverend Parkinson is my grandfather, Don Rayleigh, who was the chairman of the Board of Trustees at the time. Pretty good looking group of fellas, right? The cornerstone for West Hall is just outside the door you came in today. Here's a picture of it being set up, along with a time capsule that was placed inside of it. Who knows if we'll ever see what's inside of it? And like every building project beforehand, another organ was planned for the sanctuary. Donated by the Gibbs and Pryor families, a new organ was designed and built by the Shantz Organ Company out of Orrville, Ohio. Sorry, Heather, I didn't have one of you. We've got David with us here in spirit today. It's had a few upgrades and some renovations of its own over the years, but it is still the organ that we use today. It's an incredible instrument that I like to call the monster in the walls. People like to think of the organ as just the console you see the organist playing, but the organ is built into all 4 floors of the building, from the basement to the 3rd floor. It has 4 manuals, 72 ranks, 58 stops, and 4,358 pipes. How about that? In November of 1952, at a cost of over $500,000, the new addition and sanctuary were dedicated and put into full use. Here are a few photos from when that work was first completed. Sanctuary, Westminster Hall, the chapel. Something interesting that we learned in our fat gathering is that the large bronze Celtic cross that was made for the chancel back then and was in use in our sanctuary until our renovations last year was made by an artist by the name of Jack Worthington. You may be more familiar with some of his other work. As he was the original artist who created the bronze busts in the Football Hall of Fame. Now, I thought that was a really cool coincidence until I noticed in my research that a Mrs. William Umstadt, a longtime member, was involved with the Design and Symbolism Committee. Mr. William Umstadt was very active in the community as president of the Timken Company, but was also notably the driving force behind Canton's bid to become the home of the Pro Football Hall of Fame. It makes me wonder if it was that connection making the cross here that led to Jack Worthington's involvement with the Hall of Fame 10 years later. A lot of big things happened during the years that Reverend Parkinson was pastor. In 1944, he created the Cathedral Hour, which broadcasts our Sunday service on the radio, and still continues to this day on 1480 AM WHBC. In 1959, we opened our 93-acre summer camp, Camp Wakanda, on Leesville Lake, which celebrated its 60th anniversary just a couple of years ago. Reverend Parkinson served as our pastor until 1978. At the height of his years, the church grew to over 3,000 members and had a youth group numbering in the hundreds. We also had our first name change while he was pastor. In 1961, due to a merging of Presbyterian denominations, we had to make a change as there were 2 First Presbyterian churches in the area. We changed our name to Christ United Presbyterian Church, and the other became known as John Knox Presbyterian Church. We had a second name change in 1983, again due to a move in the denomination, and we shortened the name to Christ Presbyterian Church. These days, we often shorten that to Christ Church. As the years move forward and the culture has shifted, our membership might not be 3,000 anymore, but we are still a strong, vital congregation who are serving, learning, and growing together. Our food and clothing ministry has operated for over 40 years and serves the poorest of our community twice a month with a hot meal, free groceries and toiletries, free clothes, as well as creating an environment where they are valued and welcomed. Our music ministry, from our chancel choir to our concert series, provides incredible music, both in worship and to our community. A few years ago, we welcomed Tikva, Hands of Hope, into the building, an amazing organization that provides after-school support to Canton City school children and their families with hot meals, homework support, enrichment activities, and character development opportunities. What a blessing it is to partner with them in serving the children of Canton. So about 6 years ago, a group of members started talking about making some improvements to the sanctuary, which, while a beautiful space, was starting to show its age a bit, lacked accessibility, and had some acoustical issues that we hear about all the time, that made it harder to hear in certain parts of the room. But as they talked about the possibilities, they quickly realized that we couldn't talk about the space without first taking the time to understand where and how the Spirit was leading us. There's the saying, if you build it, they will come. Well, no offense to the baseball movie fans in the room, but what a load of baloney. We knew that a successful project was going to be about a lot more than just construction. So 4 years ago, the Spirit and Space Committee was formed. Instead of making decisions, they started asking questions. How do we partner with our community? Where and how were we needed to meet the needs of our neighbors? Those weren't questions we could just answer in-house. So over the course of a year, we held a series of World Cafes, gatherings where we invited civic and business leaders and started a dialogue on how we could be of help to them and to our community. We met with and heard the needs of our neighbors. We talked to our congregation to hear what were we lacking and what were your dreams for the next 200 years of Christ Church. We quickly came to understand that meeting the needs of and serving our congregation and community was a whole lot bigger than some upgrades to our sanctuary. We needed to reimagine our building as an inviting, welcoming, and accessible space to both stranger and friend. So as every previous building project at this church has taught us, this project was going to be a lot bigger than we initially thought it would be. It took about a year for us to take all of that raw data and distill it down into something we could manage and achieve. With the help of the architectural firm Chambers, Murphy & Burge out of Akron, we took all of those ideas and turned them into real plans. In April of 2019, we kicked off our ambitious Gather Us In Capital campaign with the goal of raising $2.5 million to fulfill our goals, making the building more welcoming, inviting, and accessible. For the sanctuary, it meant creating a worship space that was flexible, adaptable, accessible, and inspirational. And we can't forget about the spirit side of this project. $250,000 of the campaign was earmarked to help fund developing programs, community engagement and outreach, spiritual development, and mission work. We had no idea that less than a year later, COVID would arrive. And we were all worried that the giving to the campaign would dry up. We wouldn't be able to get the workers and supplies we needed for the project, and the whole thing would fall apart. But our congregation remained completely dedicated to the vision, and thanks to all of you, we met that high fundraising goal. Our contractors from Regency Construction out of Cleveland were phenomenal to work with, and we finished the project on time and slightly under budget. Thanks to the pandemic, we had to come up with some creative ways to keep our congregation informed, as most of the construction happened while all of you were worshiping from home. When everything shut down in March of 2020, we had to not only figure out how to have meaningful worship remotely, thank you, Brian, and move all of our classes and programs online, we had the unique challenge of having to help our congregation say goodbye remotely to a sanctuary and space that many of you grew up in, were baptized in, married in, family funerals had been held in, and was beloved. We also wanted to help the congregation stay engaged in the changes and progress as it was happening, even though they couldn't be here to see it. So every couple of weeks, I would tie my children's sermon into the renovation and take the congregation on a video tour of the work as it was happening. I felt a little like a home improvement show host, but I hope it helped all of you feel connected to what was happening here. The construction was completed in May of 2021, and I think that the end result turned out amazingly. Every detail looks purposeful and fitting of this grand old church as we rise to meet the needs of our future. On a personal note, I have to add what an honor it was to be so involved with the project. I like to think my grandpa Don would be pretty proud of what we did here, and I think we are off to a great start for our next 200 years. Thank you.
Don't say too much. Two mics here at the table, so you have to pass it down. So in the last several moments, thank you, Jenny. That was, I learned a few things. We were partners along the way in reading through Dr. Ramsayer's book, which, by the way, I should have brought it up right now. That back table there, Jane, could you do a little wave right there? There are a few things on that table that if you don't have them already, you may take. Not everything, please do not take everything. But there is a blue book, which is now it's 50 years old, but if you don't have it, please take it. There is the little, what do you call those things? Cat's Meow, thank you. We've got a few Cat's Meow. I opened a cabinet and found about 100 of those, so there's a couple. If you don't have one yet, just take it, please. And then 50 years ago, they thought, let's make some coins commemorating the 150th anniversary. And again, Ben and his kids and I found a couple thousand this afternoon. So if you wanted one or 10 or 20, please take some on your way out. But we've learned so much about our building. We have so many things to be thankful for. All the names, even if you didn't recognize a single name that Jenny mentioned, we know that there have been many generations of folks who have loved the Lord and who have loved this congregation. And that's what I so love about studying the history of our church, is that there are so many people beyond our knowing sometimes that have poured their lives out, spent their lives here, been married, baptized their children, were buried here. And we may not know them, but they are still known to the Lord. They are with the Lord. And so we are thankful for those memories. And so from talking about the building, now we're going to have about 15, 20 minutes here to share some stories of our congregation. So I've invited these 6 volunteers, to share with us. Let me pull up my notes here. There we go. So I'd invite you, if we could start down here, and if you could just introduce yourself and say, how long have you been here? How did you come into the church?
Dan Moretta. I came by letter of transfer around 1980.
1980.
I'm Pam Moretta. My maiden name was Barr. My grandparents were members of this church, and my parents were members of this church. I was baptized at this church and confirmed at this church.
Wow.
Ditto.
But you're not Pam Moretta.
Oh, yeah. I'm not Pam Moretta. I'm Bert Smith.
So I'm Jerry Norton, and I came to this church by being invited by a member of the choir to come and sing for some special music in 1981. And that's how I ended up, since I was practicing with the choir for this special stuff, but I also did the Sunday morning things, I thought, well, maybe I just ought to come on Sunday morning and sing too. And so that's how I ended up here.
And Jerry, can I ask, who was that invited you?
This a fellow named David Miller.
Oh.
He said, I said, I've never sung in a choir before. He says, look, he was a tuba player, and I'm a trombone player. He says, I know you can read music. He said, so that's first thing, and I'll sit next to you and help you out. So it was great.
I'm Romy Anderson, and my dad, Kevin Anderson, grew up here, and we used to live in Florida, but in 2008, I think, is when we came back.
I'm Molly Hudson. My grandparents went here, Mildred and David Snyder. My mom went here, Avery Snyder, now Hudson, and I've been here since birth. So 2001, I got baptized here, and Romy and I both got confirmed here.
Great. Thank you all. So this is their first time being on a panel and having this, so they're all a little nervous. But so we'll give them some grace and some credit here. But I want to hear some stories from any one of you about what were some of your earliest memories here. I know some of you grew up here, some of you have generations, and some of you don't have necessarily multiple decades of history here. But what were some of your earliest memories of the church?
Okay, so I'm one of 6 kids, and my dad would sit on the end in the 4th pew on the pulpit side, and George Parkinson was preaching, and he was up looking down at our row. And so if one of us would act up, you would get picked up over my mom's lap, who sat at the other end. And so eventually the kids ended up all on one side with my mom. So, but that's probably my earliest memory.
That's great.
Unlike Pam,
You were well behaved.
I think I spent most of my time under the pew. So I frankly don't have a lot of early memories about worship. What I have early memories about are Christian education, Sunday school. And I remember Mrs. Baird in this Sunday school class back here around where Dave DeVries's office is now. I was horrified and upset with her when she insisted I use a brown paper towel instead of a Kleenex on my nose. You asked for earliest memories.
Yes, please. That's great. Exactly what I wanted. Yeah.
But and I had my own mother as a Sunday school teacher for 2 years. And that was because of the way my age fell, and they were going to get me all caught up with the same kids that I would be going to high school and elementary school with. Contrary to popular opinion, I did not fail Sunday school. I simply had 2 years to catch up with those, or so the story goes.
That's great.
So actually, my first time in this building, I was invited by that same David Miller to come to an organ concert given at the time by Jeff Brandis, the organist and director of music here. And I remember sitting in the balcony, and I can't say a connoisseur of organ music, but I remember being fascinated by the variety of sound, and also wondering, why couldn't they have little lights that would flash on the pipes every time? Well, anyhow, that's my first memory.
Yeah.
Yeah, next 200 years, the next 200 years.
That's great.
One of my first memories was actually meeting Miss Romy Anderson. Oh, yeah, you're welcome. And also Katie Norton. Hi, Katie. But I remember going to Sunday school with them, and I remember Romy was much better at listening and paying attention, so she would. So actually, it was in Mrs. Smith's class. Where's Bonnie Smith's mom? Hi. We were in her class. We were in her Sunday school class, and I just remember sitting by Romy, and every once in a while, I just knew that you would like kick me or something to like pay attention or something, and I always felt bad. I'm sorry. I loved you. Were great. You were great. This was just an early memory. It's the best I could come up with.
I love it.
But yeah, so Romy was actually one of my first friends, and she's still my best friend to this day.
That's great. We're unscripted, so I'm kind of looking at them, and they're communicating telepathically here. Okay. So how are? Do you have any family stories? Some of you, 2 of you here in the middle, said your family has been here for generations, and I know. Actually, no, is you as well, Molly. You're the Snyder clan, right? Has been here for how many generations? Do we know?
I think I'm the third.
Third? Okay. So we have multiple generations here represented. What do you...
Not me.
Not you. Yeah, some of you. Some of you are representing multiple generations. So what are some of those other, not just the using the paper towel instead of a Kleenex kind of story, but other kind of family stories, going to church together, or those special moments as families across the generations that you can remember from childhood or from your years as teenagers? What are some of those special family stories that you treasure? Uh-oh.
This is kind of a connection of generations story. My mother was very, very active in this church. She was an elder. She was a Sunday school teacher. In earlier years, she participated in choir. And she knew everybody. She was really a people person. She knew everybody's name. My father was just the opposite. She helped him repeatedly remembering who people were and are. My wife does the same thing for me. But Mom just knew everybody and knew everybody's name. Skip a couple generations, and we were in church on one Sunday, and my daughter Bonnie stood up on the pew. She was very young, and she started pointing out people and their names and who they were related to. And it's like, Jean Ann is back.
I remember going down to Camp Wakanda for ox roast, and that was always a multi-generational thing. Parents and grandparents going along with that, and just enjoying the day at Camp Wakanda with the family.
Go ahead.
I would just say mine's more at camp too. My parents met at camp, and then so when we always went down, they would see counselors that they knew, and then it became me being a counselor this year, having like kids of like their friends, and I don't know, learning that. And then Bonnie was my first counselor, and that would also be my first memory of church, is like being in Bonnie's cabin with Katie Norton over there, and like now like Bonnie's like Theo, and I don't know, yeah, getting to, I don't know, work with that.
That's great. That's great. So we already had a couple mentions of Camp Wakanda. What I so love about this church and learning more about its history is that it has a wide range of things, right? Some churches are just, you got to come into the building to experience the ministry of the church. But of course, as Jenny's mentioned, back in 1959, we started Camp Wakanda. And so for many of you, memories and treasured memories happened right down there. I know we joke, where's Ben? Ben and I joke sometimes that we need to start a list of all the people who have met their spouses at camp, because there are lots of, right, just like Ben. Ben and Kate met at camp, right? So there's lots of beautiful things going on there at Wakanda, but also, of course, we have our yearly trips out west. We have our long history there in Thailand and supporting missions. And there's so many things that this church has been involved with over the generations. It's amazing to see and to be a part of, to witness. And so one of my next questions are, what are some of those meaningful experiences, whether here at church or at Wakanda, out west? What are some of those most meaningful memories? I know a lot of you have been out west, a lot of you have been to Wakanda. What have some of those memories been like?
Wait, can you repeat the question?
Just tell me any story at all.
Just any story about camp?
Great.
I'm sorry.
No, you're
I'm
fine.
so
You're
sorry.
great.
I had it and I lost it. I think most of us in this room can pretty much agree the impact that Camp Wakanda has on all of us and this church and community. So I think just being able to officially be a part. I remember it was Catherine Opart who finally convinced me. It was literally Sunday, and she looked at me and said, "You need to come to camp." And I was like, "Oh my gosh, I'll come." So I went literally that day, and I've been going for the past 9 years, and just being able to meet new people, see old faces, get to meet people from all across the world, and I'm still in contact with friends from Poland, Mexico, New Zealand, and all that stuff. So yeah, it's just a great community.
So what I'm recalling is the time the choir got invited to be the choir in residence at Washington National Cathedral.
Oh, wow.
In I guess it was July of 2007. And we were there for a weekend. We sang an evensong on Friday. We sang with the service on Sunday. We gave a concert Sunday afternoon and then sang an evensong then, I believe, too. Is that right, Bert? Anyhow, a lot of singing. And it was an honor, and it was a remarkable experience. I was one of the first people from the choir who got there because we were in a car. The rest of the choir was in a bus, and so I got there, and the docents there, because it's a tourist attraction, as you know, come up and say, "Oh, are you here for a tour?" And I said, "Well, no, I'm actually one of the first people from the Christ Presbyterian Church choir from Canton, Ohio, and we're going to be here this weekend." She says, "Oh, you need the verger whose name I cannot remember." But this gentleman came up then and said, "My job is to make you get lost here this weekend." And we did. We got lost in the space and the music. It was a wonderful opportunity for us and to minister to a wider community.
Dan and I had the pleasure of going on the Israel trip, and that was just so impactful. The way that it was the tour group that we were with, the tour guide that we were with, the people that we were with, having Rabbi Spitzer there and Pastor Dave, it just was such a pleasure. That was very impactful.
Any other meaningful experiences either here in the building or beyond?
I could talk about camp all day, but I'm going to talk about Mission West. It's been a while, since it's been happening again, but when I think about the community there's a lot of it's known for being different ages go, and so when we go, there's one trip that I went on, and we had to get groceries for all the kids because we cook them breakfast and lunch, and I don't know, and think maybe Nancy put it together a game show. She gave us a list and we had a contest, and my partner was Courtney, and we were running around the whole store, and it was just fun to see everyone from Canton, Ohio, running around a grocery store in Pine Ridge, South Dakota, buying food for kids, and Courtney and I did win, but yeah.
That's great. That's great. I love it. Yeah, go ahead, Dan.
So I can talk. My comment is sort of maybe a summary of all the questions and comments we heard earlier. I grew up Perry Heights, Richville area, and I worshiped at a church down in the southwest end of Canton, Trinity Evangelical United Brethren. We were the EUB group. My mother graduated from Cleveland Bible College, which is now Malone, with a divinity degree. And I grew up in that church. She was not a pastor per se, but she did a lot of adult education and children's education. She and my grandmother were my Sunday school teachers for as long as I could remember. My aunt was the choir director. My other aunt was instrumental in helping with building decoration and management. What I'm trying to tell you is I was very comfortable surrounded by family and friends at a church just down the road. I came to find out that through my relationship with John Geib that he looked, when my mother passed, he did the funeral. He read some of her writings and looked at some of her books and said she was very, very progressive. And the EUB church, without being critical, was, we had altar calls and the whole deal. It was a very different way of worshiping than we do here. The day it happened, I can't quite remember, but I know what it was. I was in the car, in the back seat. My mom and dad were in the front seat, and my mother put on WHBC on the ride home from EUB back to Richville, and I heard George Parkinson preach. And I said from the back seat, "Mom, who is that guy?" I've never heard any preaching like that. I don't know what this is. And again, I didn't know who my mother was. She was my mother. She was my Sunday school teacher. I didn't. But she took a minute to explain it to me, and something hit me. It never went away. I knew George Parkinson, and I knew I wanted to hear more. To make a long story short, my dad would sing in the choir, and if you've ever seen that building, it's a strange building. But anyways, the choir has a back entrance, and there was like a locker room where they hung their clothes and stuff, and they walked right into the choir loft. And I would sneak out of church when I would watch my watch. I would sneak out of church. I would go outside the building, go inside. I'd get my dad's car keys. I'd run out, and I would start his car. And I would sit in the car and listen to George preach. I don't know if I ever heard a benediction in my church after about age 12. And I asked my mom about this church, and it was a mystery. And again, jump ahead a few years, and I met this lovely lady at Altman Hospital. And she obviously had pretty much the same effect on me that George Parkinson had. Life changing, right? Come to find out that she worshiped here, and things started going off in my head like, yeah, I don't know if this is coincidence or not. Maybe this was meant to be. And I've been blessed to then marry in this church and transfer and be a member. And I met Jim Kettlewell in the Westminster class. And he asked me to take over Westminster. And again, I only did it because of my mother and Jim. And I've been privileged to help mentor, move along, help organize the Westminster class ever since. Don't think that it was just coincidence that all this came together. And I've been blessed, and that radio program changed my life from the back seat of my dad's car.
Thank you, Dan. So we've heard a few names already from Jenny and from you all of certain saints that were meaningful in your life. We recognize that we all have those Sunday school teachers, preachers, friends, mentors, confirmation teachers, youth directors, the list goes on and on. And as we're sitting here, I don't know about you, but there are certain people that I miss. I've only been here 6 years, and we have celebrated the resurrection for a lot of people in these last few years. And so we've already mentioned a few names, but I wonder, are there for you up here any other folks that you give God thanks for tonight, and you want to share what specific people meant to you who may be among us or who may be with the Lord? Are there certain saints that stand out for you?
Well, I just mentioned Jim, and I just, again, would have to lift him up tonight for the opportunity to be involved in this church. It's probably, because of the way I work, it's probably the only thing I really can do, and I really appreciate that opportunity.
Can a saint still be living?
Sure.
Because there are so many people in this room that have influenced my life and had such an impact. And I don't think I'd be the person I am today without so many of your faces out there. But to name a few that have passed, I'd have to say Dorothy Scott, Harriet Ledbetter, just some people who have really, really touched my heart. So.
Yeah, so of course, my parents, but my dad died when I was, 25? Something like that. And I had somebody that I called my choir dad, and that was Jim Steen. And Al Freese was right there with him. Men who were inspirations, men who were serious about their faith. men who also knew how to have a fun time and give me a well-deserved hard time every once in a while. They were very important to me, and I miss them still.
So I was thinking of Dorothy Scott, and I just delighted in knowing her. Another saint is Gloria Atwell, mother-in-law, if you will. When Linda and I got married here,
in 3rd grade, and then I got to work with her last year, and so she's like been able to watch me grow up. And Ben, who was my boss last summer, and be able to like walk into their home and like see how they raise their families, and like, yeah.
You could say ditto. You could say ditto.
Yeah, ditto, I guess. But also, yes, all you lovely people who work at Camp Wakanda, my weird Uncle Ben and my crazy Aunt Kate, like, they're just my camp mom. I love you, Kate. So I would also say both of my grandpas, one of them went here, David Snyder. He actually helped put together Mission West. So when I got to go on the trip for the first time with the Stalkers, and oh gosh, there's so many of you guys in here, I'm just looking at you guys. But being able to do that trip, it really that was awesome to be able to be like, oh, I completed his goal and did what he wanted me to do. But also my other grandpa, Bill Hudson, who's my dad's dad, he was actually a reverend in a town that I can't think of, Cadiz, Ohio. And he actually baptized me here, so it was really cool to just kind of share that with both of them.
So another non-coincidence was in high school, I played in a band, Keith Richards and the Rise and Soul Review. Now, I tell you that not to point out that it was a very unusual mix of racial, you get it. But to tell you this, we got invited to play at Wakanda on a Saturday night. So Keith Richards and Ryan Sower, we packed everything up and we sat in Wakanda in the, what's the fellowship hall called?
The Lodge.
The Lodge. In the corner, and we played. Now there were rules, but they let us stay till 11:30. Well, it was too dark, too late to leave. So they said we could sleep in the lodge, but we had to stay in the lodge. We had a bass player who didn't like rules. And you all know the back of the lodge is that like cliff and how dark it is in Carroll County. He fell trying to find out where the girls' cabin was. Now, why did I tell you that story in relationships to saints? Guess who I met at about midnight on a Saturday night at Wakanda? Dick Barn. We shared ideas when we started the Logos Institute, which was part of Dave's idea for an abbey here at the Christ Church.
Thank you. Whoop. Yeah. So thank you, panel. Dave wants to say one thing to you here before we thank you.
You've been pastor at church for 20 years. And one of the greatest privileges that you can say just about every member of the congregation is a friend. So, friend and personal surgeon gave me a new hip.
Yeah.
Friend, clerk of session for many years. Bert, friend, elder serving right now, choir member. Jerry, elder, serving now. And choir, and then these two. I'd had the privilege of watching them grow up. How old are you? 21. Both 21. I got here when they were 1 year old. And the privilege of watching them grow up. Yeah, it's weird.
So, From generation to generation, we are thankful for all that God is doing here in our midst for the last 200 years and for 200 years to come. So thank you. Let's give them a round of applause. Thank you for sharing your stories. We are going to sing in just another moment, but I want to give you a plug, 2 brief plugs. First of all, there are several tables around this side of the room. I invite you afterwards, tomorrow as well. These will be up for a couple weeks maybe, to take your time and look through them. You'll see lots of old faces and lots of memories, some that we don't even know lots of faces of. Also, tomorrow at 9:15, you're invited to come right back here to this room. It is our last Sunday school of the year. We've been studying the history of the church, and the last few weeks we've been talking about our own stories. So I was asking the questions of these 6, if certain memories came to mind, certain people flashed across your mind that you want to lift up, that you want to share, tomorrow is the time when it will be a group. We are going to celebrate all of our stories, and you are invited to share those stories tomorrow. Again, 9:15, be here. Britt?
I am going to be as brief as I can be, because you've already figured out why I consider myself the most blessed pastor in Ohio. With the staff I've enjoyed over the 20 years here, it's just a blessing. It's all you can say is God has been with me, because God is palpable in this place. God's presence is palpable in our sanctuary. It's palpable here tonight. At least for me. So, future story. The old line is the best prediction of tomorrow is yesterday. Right? You want to know what the future's going to be? Look at the past. So we are, I think, we're rather big on studying the scriptures around here. So I was thinking about this afternoon. By the way, I've also been thinking of Dick Barnard all day. I don't know why. Because he was here forever, but he was such a dear, good friend to me. And I'm missing a lot of people tonight. But Rich McElroy came across my mind today too, because he would have loved this moment, this historical moment. He would have just reveled in it. And so many people going through my mind. Bible study. And you look at the scriptures and you realize that in the first pages of the Hebrew scriptures, what do we find God doing? Yes, creating, but of equal importance, we find God witnessing what it is to be faithful. Adam and Eve barely come out of the womb, and God has to rescue them. The stupid apple. God is faithful to Adam and Eve. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, all find their place in God's narrative. And each one of them has to count on God's faithfulness. A people find themselves in slavery, under the lash, belittled in their own culture. God is faithful to them. He brings them into the land of milk and honey. God is faithful. The people, of course, they rebel. It's in our nature. Again and again. Yet God proves faithful. Amongst one of those, or following one of those big rebellions, what is it? He sends David. And the whole Jewish community has this time of blessing and wonder. They get full of themselves again, and well, a faithful God is going to send his people into exile, because that's what a faithful God needed to do to call his people back. Prophets, each with a word of faithfulness from God to a fallen people. History continues to move, and again, fulfilling the promise made, God sends a Savior. We celebrate that Savior as our Savior, Jesus. Defeats the power of sin and evil. God is faithful. "50 days, 40 days Ascension, 50 days Pentecost. And God anoints those to take the word out into the world. Peter and Paul come to mind, a host of others. The history of Scripture is the history of God's faithfulness to you and to me, and to those who've gone before us. Now, since Christ was raised from the dead, all that span of history, a good 10% of it belongs to us. And if we look at the years that this church has ministered, we're going to find the same thing. We came into this world as a congregation in the midst of racial strife, the 1820s, as the whole debate about slavery was beginning to form, and arguments were being made, and theologies were being developed. And of course, it ended in the Great Civil War. Death unimaginable. But we're still here. This congregation moved through that war, and it continued to minister. You think of all the times since then. Consider what moves we have made. Sure, pull out the big ones. World War I, the Depression, the Dust Bowl, World War II, the 60s, 62, Cuban Missile Crisis, 63, John F. Kennedy's assassinated, 64, the Equal Rights Amendment, the assassination of the assassination of Robert Kennedy, the assassination of Martin Luther King, all impacted the church. All those things impacted the church. We're here. We remain. The 60s, the 70s, Watergate. How many more wars since then? And most recently. COVID. We're still here. God has proven faithful to us for 200 years and is faithful still. Matt attempted to answer the same question, what does the future hold for Christ Presbyterian Church? Well, I could be really tacky and, that bumper sticker. That bumper sticker. I don't know what the future holds, but I know who holds the future. Yeah. I don't know what the future holds for this congregation. I know we are incredibly talented people. I know we are incredibly faithful people. I know we are people who can worship better than any other people I know. And not because of its leadership, but because of its heart. We can sing, and we can pray, and we can study the scriptures. Better than anyone I know, any congregation I know. There's some that are bigger, a lot that are smaller. But we are a faithful people. And God has been faithful to us. For 200 years, God has been faithful to us. What's the future look like? I don't know. The one thing I know is that God will continue to be faithful to us in Jesus Christ. I hold that in my hand. I hold that in my mind. I hold that in my heart. Tomorrow we will gather together to worship, to do what we do best. We will gather together to thank God for God's thankfulness and faithfulness. That's what we will do, because that's who we are. We are those who respond to God's faithfulness with our own faithfulness. Dick, I wish you were here. Dick, I'm glad you were here. I'm thankful for many in this room who have come to join us this night. You're part of our faith story. And I'm very thankful you will join us tomorrow in worship. And raise your voice with us again, thanking God for God's continued faithfulness. There's a song most of us know, and I'm going to ask, I know the choir is going to do a benediction, but there is a song that I think we all know the words to, and I'm just going to ask us to sing it 3 or 4 times together. It's "Take, Oh Take Me As I Am." If you don't know the words, listen 1 or 2 times, and you'll know them. You're going to play it? What did I tell you about staff? These are miracle workers. I invite you to just take in those words, to let those words wash over your body. And 3, 4 times, and then you guys take over because you can.